All right. Yes. Well, thank you everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a privilege to speak here again about a topic that I close to my own heart. And I think it's a topic that I've been thinking about since really coming to faith in Christ. But all the issues around the question of who is Jesus, is he quite different to the figure the church later proclaimed, as is often alleged? Lots of those questions were waiting for me when I was actually at George Whitfield College and studied in a little bit more depth. Questions of the historical Jesus and so on. And so, yeah, this talk really arises out of some of my own reflection, and then also recently benefiting a great deal from a book with this title, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, by a British historian and theologian, Richard Bauckham. The first edition came out in 2008, I believe, and the revised edition in 2014. And yeah, he presents a really compelling case, I think, the gospel is being based on eyewitness testimony and goes against the trend of a lot of contemporary scholarship. So yeah, these are some personal reflections, but a lot I'm going to be drawing quite a bit, as you will see, from Richard Bauckham's work. And that's really what I want this evening. I just really want to start that conversation. Is the real Jesus of history quite different to the Christ of faith who the church proclaims? So where do we see this idea in popular culture? Well, that's a Time magazine title page. Anybody guess what year that is?
It could be every year.
It could be every year. Yes,
It says
right?
August something.
Oh,
Yes, August like
you got very nice. Good eye.
August 15 something or other up at the top
Okay,
of
yeah,
the
yeah. 1988. Okay, at the time that the last is the Last Temptation of Christ was coming out, and yeah, here you have this headline: Who was Jesus? A startling new movie. Oh, I should read better here.
Raises an age-old question.
Raises an age-old question. Okay. So then, 1988, the movie raised lots of questions. What really happened to Jesus? Did he perhaps marry Mary Magdalene and have a life? Did he really die on the cross? All of those kind of historical questions. Fast forward another decade or so, familiar also with the Da Vinci Code. The church sort of covered up the real story of Jesus. There were powerful interests at play, and the real story of Jesus was covered up. Even more recently, Philip Pullman, many of us will probably be familiar with some of his fiction. He's written a book more recently called The Good Man Jesus and The Scoundrel Christ. It's sort of a fictional tale of this wonderful teacher, Jesus, and then this imposter, Christ, who sort of takes the legacy of Jesus and just founds this powerful institution, the church, which he controls, and sort of uses that legacy of Jesus for his own selfish interests. I think often people project their own bad experiences of the church onto this question of the historical Jesus. But you see it in contemporary popular culture, this bifurcation, this division between the real Jesus of history and the Christ whom the church worships and proclaims. You also see it in contemporary scholarship. One of the best known contemporary scholars, and I'm just going to read it straight from here, Bart Ehrman, wrote a book a couple of years ago, How Jesus Became God. And this is just a couple of lines from the book that I think expresses a very common viewpoint as we think about the origins of the Gospels. So anyone who converted to become a follower of Jesus could and did tell the stories. A convert would tell his wife. If she converted, she would tell her neighbor. If she converted, she would tell her husband. If he converted, he would tell his business partner. If he converted, he would take a business trip to another city and tell his business associates. If he converted, he would tell his wife. If she converted, she would tell her neighbor, and so on and on. Who then was telling the stories about Jesus? Just the apostles? It can't have been just the apostles. Eventually, an author heard the stories in his church. Say it was Mark in the city of Rome, and he wrote his account. Okay, so the presupposition behind that is that there's this long sequence of oral tradition and so the passing on of the story of Jesus before it was eventually written down. And so the gospel accounts actually became quite disconnected from the original events, even geographically. Mark is in Rome, and he is sixth hand or 10th hand heard these stories about Jesus, and he undertakes to write down the account of the gospel according to Mark. So we have this division between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And in order to understand this question, we really have to go back to the Enlightenment, really, to look at the historical roots, where this division sort of really first came into play. You'll often probably hear, if you ever look into this question, especially of the historical Jesus, hear of the German philosopher Gotthold Lessing, writing at the height of the Enlightenment. And here's a very famous quote of his: if no historical truth can be demonstrated, then nothing can be demonstrated by means of historical truths. That is, accidental truths of history can never become the proof of necessary truths of reason. That then is the ugly broad ditch which I cannot get across, however often and however earnestly I try to make the leap. So you often hear people talking about this broad ugly ditch. So how do we get across 2 millennia of history to retrieve the real historical Jesus? Okay, so writing at the sort of the height of the Enlightenment, we were saying, what can we really be certain of? I can't demonstrate a historical truth. What I can demonstrate is the force of gravity. We can go and have a repeatable experiment, and drop the ball from the Leaning Tower of Pisa and measure how fast it accelerates. That is a necessary truth of reason, something that I can prove logically. But the truths of history become secondary, and they can never be demonstrated. Okay, so that is sort of that's the backdrop, and so ever since Lessing sort of wrote that, I suppose people have been trying to cross that broad ugly ditch. How can we retrieve real history? So do we accept that sort of division that he has there? So let's continue onwards into the 19th century, so-called quests for the historical Jesus. Lots of attempts to try and retrieve who was the real Jesus and strip from the dogmatic assumptions of the church. Okay, so saying we can't just accept what the church has told us for centuries. Let's see if just using the criteria of history, scientific history, if we can figure out who the real historical Jesus was. So D.F. Strauss wrote a famous book, The Life of Jesus, critically examined in 1836. And here, again, we can't accept all the miraculous elements, of course. Naturalistic worldview says those couldn't have happened. So the early church must have sort of developed these stories in order to present Jesus as the Messiah who fulfills the Jewish prophecies. So all Jesus' miracles are explained through some kind of natural means. The feeding of the 5,000. Jesus must have had secret helpers there who came out and gave bread to all the people at the right time, making people think that Jesus had really multiplied the loaves and fishes. Ernest Renan, another one, The Life of Jesus. Quite anti-Semitic account that, but in the 19th century, there were a multitude of sort of lives of the historical Jesus. And then a very famous book early in the 20th century, and a very famous figure, Albert Schweitzer, wrote a book called The Quest of the Historical Jesus in 1906. And really what he did was actually he looked back at the 19th century, all of these lives of the historical Jesus. And he showed that what many of these people, like Strauss and Renan, actually found, or the picture of Jesus that they portrayed, was really just sort of the ideal man in their own culture. Okay, so they claimed to be sort of doing scientific history, but the figure who was coming out was actually just sort of the ideal German Protestant, or the ideal moral German man. And so here's a quote which is actually often attributed to Schweitzer, but it actually comes from someone else. But the illustration that he uses, and I think it really fits what Schweitzer was saying, is that all of these previous scholars, it was like looking down a deep well, remember the broad ditch, and trying to see what did Jesus look like, this long, deep well, the real historical Jesus. And what they were seeing down the deep well, actually just their own reflection coming back. So this is, people often think this is Schweitzer, but it's actually George Tyrrell in 1910. And Adolf Harnack is one of these liberal Protestant figures. But he says the Christ that Adolf Harnack sees, looking back through 19th century to Catholic darkness, is only the reflection of a liberal Protestant face seen at the bottom of the deep well. Okay, so Schweitzer, in some ways, sort of set the path for the historical Jesus and called scholars back to the task of setting Jesus within his first century Jewish historical context. Okay? So we can't have a Jesus coming out looking like a Reformation German Protestant. But the sort of the backdrop against which Schweitzer portrayed Jesus was that of apocalyptic Judaism. This expectation that the Messiah would come in power and establish the kingdom of God. And he said that was Jesus' message, the kingdom of God is near. And he drew a lot of attention to Matthew 10 and sort of texts like that, where Jesus said, hey, when he was sending out the 12 on mission, before you come back, the Son of Man will come in power. And so saying that Jesus had this expectation that the Father was going to reveal him in power. And that when that didn't happen, and Jesus became convinced that he had to go to the cross to sort of twist the Father's arm into establishing the kingdom there and now. And Jesus' last sort of cry of despair on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's actually a cry of dereliction and despair, and the kingdom of God did not come like Jesus expected it to. So that was the kind of picture that Schweitzer painted. But his contribution, in a sense, was sort of calling scholars back to the first century Jewish context in which Jesus should be understood. And I think scholars always, you want to make Jesus relevant to your own time. And that's always the danger that the 19th century was faced. So where did we get to? Well, what was the state of gospel scholarship in the early 20th century? So a couple of key figures, the Cambridge Triumvirate, the Lightfoot, Westcott and Port, a philosopher, historian, and a linguist. So all from different backgrounds. They did a lot of work to actually establish a first century date for the majority of New Testament documents. Okay, so all of these guys were sort of writing towards the end of the 19th century. A lot of the German scholarship up until then had questioned a lot of that. So at that point in time, lots of people were saying, well, New Testament documents, lots of them were written sort of well into the 2nd century. So what Westcott, Lightfoot, and Port really did was they went back to the historical sources and actually established a very early date for the epistles of Ignatius and Clement, and established a date very early in the 2nd century. And of course, these epistles also quoted from the other gospel writings, and so that means that these gospel writings must have been written before that. So they made a very compelling historical case, and it's still accepted today. That the majority of the New Testament canon was completed by the end of the 1st century, and that everybody accepts that today. Scholars also began to look at the question of the relationships between the Gospels. Okay, the phrase in the 19th century was coined of the synoptic Gospels, to see together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it was recognized that they all have a very similar pattern. Often sort of almost verbatim. They seem to have the same accounts. Now the question is, what was the literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And Matthew, of course, comes first in the canon. And it's always enjoyed a certain priority in the church. And Augustine argued that the Gospel of Matthew was the first one written, and that Mark and Luke sort of copied from Matthew's Gospel. Lachman and Hosman sort of looked at this, and they actually established, I think, a case, quite a convincing case, that Mark was actually the first gospel written. Based on several grounds, Mark is the shortest of all. It's unlikely that someone would have, that people would have taken Matthew and the sacred text and sort of cut things out and made Mark. Rather happened the other way around, that Mark was written first, and that both Matthew and Luke had access to Mark, and they thought, well, Mark hasn't told the whole story. Let's add to Mark's account. If you look at the Gospels carefully, you also see that both Matthew and Luke share certain material in common that is not from Mark. Okay, so this is often labeled Q, from the German Quelle for the source. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then, of course, Matthew and Luke also have their own unique material. So that is, so these were sort of established in the early 20th century. By the time we come to mid-20th century, what really dominated gospel scholarship was often called form criticism. So all German scholars, Schmidt, Thebelius, Bultmann, were sort of pioneers of this. And really, I think the next slide really gives the essence of form criticism. So what form criticism really argued is that the source material of the Gospels was oral traditions about Jesus that circulated anonymously in the community, and they could be classified according to conventional forms. So parables of Jesus, aphorisms, proverbs, little miracle stories. But also key to form criticism was that these stories were circulated in the communities for the benefit of the community. Okay, people retold the stories of Jesus. If you think again of what Bauckham was saying, they retold the stories of Jesus to sort of edify and build up the community. And importantly as well, these stories were sort of circulated anonymously. Of course, over time, these stories sort of reshaped and then changed to meet the needs of the community. So these stories reflected the sit-in labor and the sitting in life of the Christian communities. The gospel writers at the end of the day sort of strung together these disconnected units like pearls on a string. Now Jesus in Galilee, now he's in Jerusalem. They would just sort of bring all these together and sort of weave them into the story of the Gospels. By the time we get to the later 20th century, some emphases, redaction criticism, tended to emphasize that the Gospel writers weren't just sort of collectors of traditions and then stringing them together like pearls on a string. They were actually editors in their own right. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John sort of took their materials and they've actually got a story to tell. And they actually contributed and brought something of themselves as well to the story. A lot of emphasis on literary criticism, so maybe eclipsing all these historical questions, focusing more on the narrative art of how does John tell his story. And I think that still dominates in the 21st century. Social scientific criticism, asking questions like, what was the daily wage for a worker in first century Palestine? What did they eat? How often did the Jews pray? Those type of questions. How many children did the typical Jewish family have? The Jesus seminar was also, from the 1980s until the 90s, was quite a dominant force in gospel scholarship that fallen a little bit by the wayside. I think scholars like N.T. Wright and so on have, and not even just more conservative scholars like him, I think across the board, they've been criticized. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the Jesus Seminar, Robert Funk and a few other scholars, but what they did was these scholars came together and they sort of looked at the Gospels and they sort of took sayings of Jesus and then they sort of broke them out and sort of took them out of the narrative, and then they all just sort of voted on, do you think Jesus definitely said this? Probably said this, probably didn't say this, definitely didn't say this. So they had a few different colors for all these sayings, and then they voted on. Yeah, they sort of separated the Gospel, stripped it down like that, and then voted. but yeah, the methodologically, I think a lot of it's coming to a lot of whiteboard criticism. But that was some of the late 20th century approaches. N.T. Wright and others have spoken about a third quest for the historical Jesus, asking these kind of questions. How does Jesus fit with Judaism? Coming back to that question of Albert Schweitzer. What were Jesus' aims? Why did Jesus die? How and why did the early church begin? Why are the Gospels what they are? What are the Gospels? I think why are the Gospels? But having said all of that, the dominant sort of perception, I think, in the scholarly world and in popular culture as well, I was saying in the beginning, is still visible, represented in this kind of quote. This is from the Wikipedia article on the historical reliability of the Gospels. The majority of New Testament scholars agree that the Gospels do not contain eyewitness accounts, but that they present the theologies of their communities rather than the testimony of eyewitnesses. Okay, that's all sort of dominant opinion. Here, there, again, form criticism. Still this idea that the stories reflect, they tell us more about the church than they do about the real historical Jesus. Okay? So let's revisit the
Wikipedia still holds it. It's still the same.
Well, I'm just going to see if I can change it.
Yeah.
I'm going to see what whether the priesthood of the democratization of knowledge. Test the limits of the democratization of knowledge. Yeah, I'll see.
If you can pass the bias test.
Yes.
I tried to become an editor. I couldn't pass the bias test.
I didn't know you on that too.
Yeah.
Okay, that's obviously quite closely. There's always a priesthood who is the gatekeeper of what counts for knowledge. Interesting. So let's look again at the traditional account. Of course, traditionally Christians have accepted that the gospel accounts are, as they purport to be, written by eyewitnesses. So here's a little picture of Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. So this is what Bauckham essentially argues. He says the traditions, the gospel traditions, were originated and formulated by named eyewitnesses in whose name they were transmitted and who remained living and active guarantors of the traditions. Okay, so importantly there, they were originated by named eyewitnesses. So that idea of not anonymous tradition, but named eyewitnesses, and that they remained the living guarantors of the tradition. They didn't, the moment they passed on the stories of Jesus, they didn't sort of die or they weren't immediately transported to heaven. They remained in the community as the stories were being told, and they helped shape those stories as they were told. And they also, in a sense, oversaw the production of the literary form. That takes the argument a little bit further, but in a sense, they remained the living guarantors of the tradition. So the evangelists, he says, were in more or less direct contact with eyewitnesses, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not removed from them by a long process of anonymous transmission of the traditions. Okay, so yeah, Bauckham argues that the Gospels should be regarded as testimony. Okay, and yeah, maybe we can reflect a little bit. I'm thinking I should do it now, a bit later. But he draws on many contemporary Christian philosophers, people like Calvin Plantinga, and going all the way back to philosophers like Thomas Reid, Scottish common sense realism, and so on, to argue that testimony is one of our most basic forms of human knowledge, along with my own perception and my memory. So, coming back to Gotthold Lessing's broad, ugly ditch, the only truths that I can establish are not just the sort of necessary truths of reason. In most of life, I'm reliant on testimony. So much of life is reliant on actually accepting people's testimony for what it is, unless there's good reason to doubt that testimony is valid for some reason. we can maybe pick that up in the questions a little bit. So where does Bauckham go to make this case? Firstly, he goes to ancient historiography. He argues that the sort of closest genre to the Gospels is actually Greco-Roman historiography. Here's another quote. He says, the ancient historians such as Thucydides, Polybius, Josephus, and Tacitus were convinced that true history could be written only while events were still within living memory. And they valued as their sources the oral report of the direct experience of the events by involved participants in them. There's another quote. The ideal eyewitness was not the dispassionate observer, but one who, as a participant, had been closest to the events and whose direct experience enabled him to understand and interpret the significance of what he had seen. Okay, so Josephus, for example, he was there during the Jewish war. He was a general initially on the Jewish side. Eventually, he went over to the Romans. But he actually says that at the start of his history of the Jewish war, at the start of his life, that I was an involved participant. I should actually have had a quote here from Josephus, and therefore I am qualified to actually give this account because I was there. Now, if you're going to read that whole account, there's some events where clearly he couldn't have been there as well. But there, Bauckham also actually goes and finds interesting, and we'll come to it now, interesting evidence that we even know what eyewitness source he drew on in giving that account. So he argues that the ancient historians were careful in their historiography. They weren't obviously held up to the same standard as modern historians might perhaps be, but they did believe that an account written within living memory was necessary. What external sources do we have as we think about the Gospels as historical sources? What external sources do we have that give an early date to these documents? Bauckham looks quite a bit at Papias. So Papias was Bishop of Smyrna, Hierapolis. I'm thinking of someone else, Polycarp, I think. Papias was Bishop of Hierapolis from about 60 AD to 130 AD. We have his writings preserved. Lots of these quotes actually come from the church historian Eusebius, writing about the 3rd century, and so he had access to a lot of material that we don't have today. So Papias interestingly wrote in a sense his own account with some sayings of Jesus, called the expositions of the Logia, or the sayings of the Lord. Unfortunately, that's been lost, but what we do have of that work is the prologue, which Eusebius records for us. And I'm going to give us an extended quote here from Papias' prologue. So Papias says here in that prologue to his account of some of Jesus' sayings, he says, I shall not hesitate also to put into properly ordered account for you everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders and noted down well for the truth of which I vouch. Does that sound familiar to you, those words? Properly ordered account? Yeah, beginning of Luke's Gospel, I think he's echoing that. Luke himself, I think, echoes other Roman historians as well. That idea of a properly ordered account. And he says, for unlike most people, I did not enjoy those who have a great deal to say, but those who teach the truth. Nor did I enjoy those who recall someone else's commandments, but those who remember the commandments given by the Lord to the faith, proceeding from the truth itself. He says, and if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, that is, what, according to the elders, Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew, or any of the other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. Okay, so a couple of interesting things to note there. By the time that Papias is thinking about, when he was listening to some of the elders of the church, by that time, quite a few of the disciples had died already: Andrew, Peter, Philip, James. But there were some who were still living. Aristion and the elder John were saying. He speaks in the present tense. Okay, so some of them, the elder John, the author of John's Gospel, was still living at this time. And so we're not far removed here from the original eyewitnesses. Some historians pick up on this idea of him saying he prefers information from a living and surviving voice rather than from books, this preference for oral tradition. But Bauckham, I think, rightly points out that it's only because these were eyewitnesses, that the living and surviving voice was preferred to books. It wasn't a preference for oral tradition above what's written in books per se. It was only because it was still within living memory.
So you can ask segue with
Yes, sure.
he's a bishop. How in that 60 years did it go from the apostles to bishops? Or the term bishop in the church history, do you know whether
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just a name. So I mean, you already have bishop in the New Testament, although it's not translated like that.
okay.
So episkopos, overseer. So often in the New
Okay.
Testament, it will be translated as overseer. So we use the English word bishop, perhaps to retain the Greek, and we have hierarchical connotations with bishop. But it was a episkopos and overseer. So there are a couple of
That's
words
just
like in
an
the New
elder.
Testament.
It's
Yeah.
a word for an elder.
Well, presbyteros is an elder, but you can see in the New Testament it's used synonymously with. So presbyteros and episkopos are actually used synonymously in the New Testament. But in the 2nd century, you do have sort of a movement towards monarchical bishops. So a bishop who has authority over various local churches. And so you have this threefold structure of bishop, elder, so deacons. But in the New Testament times, there wasn't such a clear hierarchy like that. Okay, so he also draws a distinction, Bauckham, between oral tradition and oral history. Okay, so we must make a distinction between these two. But to a historian, the truly distinctive characteristic of oral tradition is its transmission by word of mouth over a period longer than the contemporary generation. Okay, so oral history is that which is recorded within that generation. Beyond that, you can talk about oral tradition. So, yeah, maybe again. Yeah, so oral tradition, he argues, and it's not just Bauckham, he actually draws on various other historians as well. So scholars like Herman and so on will use those term oral tradition quite loosely, but strictly speaking, so oral tradition, it has to do with what gets passed on beyond the living generation of the events that have a concern. So then you can talk about oral tradition sort of being passed on.
Yeah, what's oral history?
Also, so oral history is what gets passed on, but still within the living memory. So oral history is within living memory. Yeah. So here I think we're very familiar with Luke's prologue to his gospel, claiming to have got information from eyewitness sources, and he again says that various people have undertaken to draw up accounts. So yeah, you can go and read Bauckham on this, but he says a lot of that language, like from the beginning, and the language of eyewitnesses echoes the Greek historian Polybius, who was widely admired as defining and exemplifying the best principles of Hellenistic historiography. Okay, if you want to have good history, you have to have someone who was there from the beginning, and you have to have someone who was eyewitness. It's interesting, if you go and read Acts, you can see Luke sort of echoing that tradition. The person who replaces Judas as an apostle has to have been someone who was with Jesus from the beginning and who was a witness of his death, his resurrection. So, okay, another unique fact that people often draw actually on this aspect of Richard Bauckham's work is he pays very careful attention to the names in the gospel traditions. And here he's really done unique historical work. And what made this work possible was actually a lexicon of Jewish Palestinian names from the first century. Or, there was a recent careful study done from all the inscriptional evidence we have, all the papyri, and that's thousands of ancient sources people have drawn up. What were the sort of common Palestinian Jewish names during that first century? And I asked the question last time. I think it might be worthwhile to reflect on again. I wonder if you know what are the most popular boys' names and the most popular girls' names in South Africa right now. If you had to take a guess, I think unless you're a parent or someone who's had to name a child recently, you probably wouldn't have such a good.
The difference from country to country.
Yeah. So maybe if you're a teacher as well, you know what the names of the children in the class. If you're a primary school teacher, you'd have some idea. But it's not easy to tell that, what the most popular names are. And if you go and look at the inscriptional evidence, you actually see that the most popular names in Jewish Palestine and even the diaspora Jewish communities in Egypt, separated by a few hundred kilometers, are very different from the Jewish names in Asia Minor. So there's quite a unique set of names. And yeah, what does he say here? He says different names, and so he also draws attention to. Actually, I've already jumped the gun here, and I'm actually making the next point. We'll get there. Just hold that in your minds. The uniqueness of the Jewish Palestinian names. But what Bauckham does is he looks at the names very carefully. Of traditions, and he says that these are important. If the names of persons well known in the Christian communities, it also becomes likely that many of these people were themselves eyewitnesses who first told and doubtless continue to tell the stories in which they appear and to which their names are attached. He says here, all three synoptic gospels repeatedly, here's an example, make the woman the subject of the verb of seeing. They saw the events of Jesus as he died. They saw where he was laid in the tomb. They went on the first day of the week to see the tomb. They saw the stone roll. They saw the young man sitting on the right side. And the angel invited them to see the empty place where Jesus' body was laid. And so the significance of that, Richard Bauckham says, that language of seeing basically draws attention to the primacy of sight, often expressed in, again, coming back to Greco-Roman historiography, a well-known saying of Heraclitus, that eyes are surer witnesses than ears. So that was a feature of the ancient Greek theory of cognition. And so that's why you have this attention drawn to what the woman saw. And so I think there's something more. There's something more here on the names. We're going to get to it, but you have interesting names like Bartimaeus, Simon of Cyrene, Joseph of Arimathea, Jairus, Mary Magdalene, Jesus' brothers, James and Joseph. And it's interesting also, what Bauckham points out, is that some names get dropped in the later Gospels, in Matthew and in Luke, for example.
Dropped, like taken out?
They get taken out of the same accounts. So, for example, the account where Jesus is carrying his cross, okay, and we're told that Simon of Cyrene was there, and because Jesus no longer carried the cross, they compelled him, Simon of Cyrene, to carry this cross. So Bauckham argues, I think quite rightly, that Simon of Cyrene was probably known in that early Jewish Christian community. And Mark were actually told that Simon of Cyrene was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why that extra detail we find, those extra named people we find in Mark's Gospel, and that father of Alexander and Rufus. And if you're going to read Matthew and Luke, they don't say anything about Alexander and Rufus. Why is that? Well, by the time Matthew and Luke were writing, maybe a decade or two later, the community had grown. They didn't know who these two figures were anymore. So their names were simply not included anymore. But basically, the point Bauckham is making is that these people, these names were the original eyewitnesses to the events. Okay, and so now we come to the Palestinian Jewish names. that I was talking about earlier. So here are some of the most popular male names. Simon occurs 243 times in the excellent sources. Joseph, Eliezer, Judah, Johanan or John, Greek form, and Joshua. So, yeah, if we go and look at this, we see that the percentages for men in the New Testament correlate remarkably closely with those of the population in general. And what Bauckham is arguing against here is sort of the thesis of someone like Harper, who says that eventually Mark heard this account, heard these stories in Rome, and he decided to write them down. If he had just made up all of these names in Rome, what chance is there that there would be such a close correspondence of the names as we actually find in the Gospel? So we should note that the pattern Jewish names in the diaspora was all the same. And also we find this interesting distinction in the Gospels. How do you tell Simon from Simon? Since Simon was the most common Jewish name, if you just said Simon, how would you know which Simon you're talking about? That's interesting. If you read the apocryphal Gospels, they don't always make this distinction, which actually shows that they belong to a later period in history. So you have, in Mark, you've got Simon the leper, Simon son of Jonah, Simon of Cyrene. All the Simons are distinguished from one another because there were so many. Okay, here's another compelling point. It's again coming from ancient historiography, and Bauckham goes and looks at other ancient historians and notices how when historians were giving an account of someone's life, so the two ancient biographies that he goes and looks at are Lucian's Alexander and Porphyry's account of Plotinus, famous philosopher. But what both of these figures do when they are giving the biographical accounts is the very first person mentioned in the account is the key eyewitness. The very first and the very last person mentioned are the key eyewitnesses who stand behind this particular account. And Bauckham goes and finds this in the Gospels as well. So the beginning and end of Mark, who are the first named disciples, as Jesus goes into Galilee, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. Told there in Mark 1:16, as Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Simon's brother Andrew casting a net into the sea. So there's actually almost an emphasis on Simon. He doesn't just say, and you can look at it in the Greek, it's not just Simon and his brother Andrew, it's Simon and Simon's brother Andrew, mentioned twice. Who's the last person mentioned after resurrection? Jesus says, or the angels rather say to the woman, go tell his disciples, and Peter is going ahead of you to Galilee, there you will see him just as he told you. So Peter is the first one named, he's the last one named. And of course, Peter's a key figure throughout the gospel as well. He's the one there, the turning point, Mark 8, where Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ, is the first one to make that confession. It's also true in John's gospel. So the beloved disciple, the witness who stands behind John's gospel, in John 21, verse 20, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following. Remember, and then Jesus says, Jesus had just predicted how Peter's going to die, and then Peter says, but what about him? And then Jesus says, if I want him to remain, what is that to you? You follow me. But the one who has the last word in John's gospel is actually John, the beloved disciple. This is the disciple who testifies to these things. This is how John ends. And actually, if you go and read John carefully, you've got this sort of anonymous figure at the start of the gospel as well, with very similar language of following. Jesus says, you follow me. And right at the beginning of the gospel, you've got these two disciples of John the Baptist, Andrew and an unnamed disciple, who were told, follow Jesus. And they remain with Jesus. That similar language, following, remaining, is there at the beginning of the gospel. Because this is the disciple who's witness stands behind the gospel. So, yeah, I think I'll skip this. It's a bit more on. This is also confirmed by our early sources. Again, Papias confirms that Peter was the eyewitness who stood behind Mark's gospel. So the external evidence and internal evidence from the gospels themselves actually match up. Peter was, that Mark effectively was recording Peter's teaching. So what Bauckham also argues, what he looks at, is that there was a formal process of the transmission of tradition. It wasn't just a matter of, and I'm sure it did happen in the way that Bauckham said, where people heard the stories about Jesus, they passed them on to others, they passed them on. But there was also a more formal process as well, where the apostle played and the eyewitnesses played a key role in being guarantors of that tradition. So you have this formal language of passing on. So the apostle Paul says, and it's interesting, he speaks about him himself receiving traditions. What I received from the Lord, what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus on the night he was betrayed. And then also here, what he says in 1 Corinthians 15, that's a short summary of the gospel. What I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for us according to the scriptures. There's also a clear distinction, the Gospels make a clear distinction between what the disciples understood before and after Jesus' death and resurrection. And I think a very important point to make that I think gives credibility to the Gospels, is giving us a window into the real first century historical Jesus, and not just a window into the later church, is that there were many controversies in the early church that the gospel writers don't attempt to address through the mouth of Jesus. Okay. So, for example, the question of Gentiles, and what do you do about Gentiles? There was a huge conflict in the early church. If you read any of Paul's letters, should the Gentiles who become followers of Jesus also be forced to obey the Jewish law and be circumcised and so on? And we don't have a saying of Jesus anywhere in the gospel saying, those who are Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. If people would have been very tempted if they were wanting to just sort of write something for the community and sort of put down rules for the community to do that kind of thing. But we don't find that kind of manipulation of the gospel accounts. And yeah, there are various other examples that we'll look to there. Okay, so in conclusion, I think I love these words of C.S. Lewis. From an essay, Permit and Elephants. It was originally entitled Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, given in 1959. And it's really about the scholars that C.S. Lewis was reading, Bauckham and so on. And he says that they came to see fluency, so tiny little details, and they can't see the elephant 10 yards away in broad daylight. So it's sort of missing sort of the big picture of what we have in the Gospels. So here's a quote from C.S. Lewis talking about contemporary at his time of his scholarship. Talking about the scholar. If he tells me that something in a gospel is legend or romance, I want to know how many legends and romances he has read. How well his palate is trained in detecting them by the flavor, not how many years he has spent on that gospel. I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this. Of this text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, in other words, eyewitness testimony, or else some unknown writer in the 2nd century without known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. So drawing attention to the genre of the Gospels. And finally, one more quote here. He says, "All theology of the liberal type involves at some points, and often involves throughout, the claim that the real behavior and purpose and teaching of Christ came very rapidly to be misunderstood and misrepresented by his followers, and has been recovered or exhumed only by modern scholars. The idea that any man or writer should be opaque to those who lived in the same culture, spoke the same language, shared the same habitual imagery and unconscious assumptions, and yet be transparent to those who have none of these advantages, is in my opinion preposterous. There is an a priori improbability in it, which almost no argument and no evidence can counterbalance. I think that's a nice way to end. I think, yeah, good, sound theological or historical judgment. Sound historical judgment there by. Okay, so I think let's end there and then we can